Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Dola Akinduro, Senior Manager of PreSales EMEA at Hubspot. The topic of today's episode is ABL, Always Be Learning. This episode is fantastic because we are going to discuss how and why pre-sales professionals need to always be learning, and how really we should be looking at this role as more than just a job, but a career and something that we take pride in to be the best version of ourselves. Dola provides some really tactical and fundamental perspectives in how we should be approaching change and approaching learning and what we should be doing to go about being the best version of our professional selves. And so you are going to really enjoy today's episode. Dola brings a lot of energy to the episode, and I hope you find a lot of great takeaways. Enjoy.
Pre-sales activities are scattered across tools, consuming a lot of work time and creative energy. Meet Prescale, an all-in-one pre-sales intelligence platform that helps you to streamline evaluation experiences, deliver impactful solutions, and improve technical conversions. With a unified workspace, Prescale enables teams to identify and engage with best-fit prospects, document niche product interactions, and accelerate product conviction to drive sales conversions. Learn more at prescale.com.
Dola, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How are you today?
Thank you so much. I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me.
I am glad to have you on the podcast. It's going to be a great conversation that we're going to have today. We actually already had a pretty great conversation before we even started recording. But before we get into it, I want to talk about the German pre-sales market, because I think it's really fascinating to kind of understand where pre-sales is on kind of the maturity curve around the globe. I have a fortunate experience that I worked for a Belgian-based company at Showpad and really got great exposure into the European market. But I am hearing a lot of differing viewpoints and opinions on where the German pre-sales market is. Can you talk to us about your perspective there?
So I think one thing to be said about the German market is that there's a lot of movement. And I think that's not necessarily unique to the German market. I think in general, there's movement everywhere. And there's a lot of movement in pre-sales, partly thanks to all of your hard work in making pre-sales popular. So thanks for making us the cool kids. In Germany, one thing I would say is we've seen a lot of what we call Quereinsteiger. So people who take a shift in their career and move into pre-sales. They've been doing something for a while and they feel like they have a lot of transferable skills and would like to try that out. So I think that's really been what we've been seeing a lot of. But at the same time, as a hiring manager, it's definitely challenging, right? Because it's a really competitive market. It's definitely candidates' pick at this point. And in Germany, and this is probably something that's more specific to Northern Europe, is we have a really, really slow transition process. So we have a 3-month notice period. And if you add to that another 3 months-ish of onboarding, we're at least 6 months before we have made an offer to someone before they can hit the funnel. And then you add to that all the time people spend thinking about whether this is the right move and what is actually pre-sales. Because although you've been doing a great job, pre-sales is the best job no one has ever heard about, right? So we're still over here trying to sort of shape and define and standardize the term pre-sales. So I think that's sort of the trends that I would call out that we've been seeing in Germany in particular.
You're right. We're trying to help continue to play our role in helping create the ecosystem. But as you mentioned, there's just so many people who don't know about this role. They don't know about the profession. And so like you said, you might have to reach out and try to convince someone to come into this profession and this role. So that onboarding experience plus a hiring notice, it's a long time. So appreciate you sharing that perspective.
Pre-sales is so different depending on which company you work for. So I'm coming from a pre-sales background, but in my previous company, it was something totally different as opposed to what I'm doing at HubSpot or what my team is doing at HubSpot here as well. So I think there's also definitely something to be said about that standardization piece around what is it actually. So I think you have a huge candidate pool, but not everybody's looking at the same job role. So you then have to sort of filter out who's the right fit or who's understood the role the way that you're going to be able to present it, right? So that's also a challenge.
I love that perspective. And that's probably a really great transition into the next question I have for you is talk to us about your pre-sales career journey. What got you to where you are today?
I always say it was partially by accident and partially on purpose. So I started out in consulting and I was bored stiff. Like it was not for me being a functional consultant. I just needed a whole lot more, much more dynamic role. So I actually shifted into project management because that allowed me to dabble in different types of projects, meet different types of stakeholders. I'm a big people person, so I love building relationships and getting out there. So I moved into project and program management, and I did that for a while. And then I was asked to join some of our senior leaders in setting up a sales strategy. And that was a super interesting role because it did allow me to not only apply what I had learned from my consulting and project management background in understanding what the customers need, but also start looking at it from a more financial perspective, as in what makes this company money and how can we use that, how can we use our knowledge of what the customers need to make this company money? So that was obviously really, really interesting. And that had me then catapulting into pre-sales. And lo and behold, I actually had that's why I say it was partially on purpose and partially not, because I had inadvertently gathered all the building blocks that I needed to enter into pre-sales and actually be quite successful in the pre-sales skill, because I guess you'll agree with me when I tell you the pre-sales is all about the transferable skills. There are no schools of pre-sales. Like there is no bachelor of pre-sales anywhere, right? So it's all about what you take with you in your luggage and in your baggage and build upon, and then are able to apply in this role. So yeah, that's my journey.
I love that you share that, because you're right. So many of us were doing different roles previously. And I think it allows for us to bring those perspectives into this profession, right? And I think it's allowed so many pre-sales professionals to make an impact in the role because they've just been approaching problem solving or approaching their day-to-day differently. And I really love your perspective of both project management and the sales aspect or sales strategy of things, because I think it helps us have empathy for the revenue side of the house in our pre-sales role. And I think some of the best pre-sales professionals really understand that. So let's get into today's topic of always be learning. We're going to call this ABL. And Dola, I'm really excited for this because with PreSales Collective, we want to help create an ecosystem. We believe that sales and buying are changing. And this profession, a fantastic job, fantastic role, but just hasn't had the support for quite some time. And I think what maybe people learned 20, 10, even 5 years ago has shifted and changed. Obviously, the pandemic has accelerated technology advancement. So really, this role is evolving. And I feel like we want to play the role in helping people better themselves and helping them learn and stay on track. And I know this is a very, very important topic to you. And you said this quote to me ahead of time is that if you do not have the luxury to do what you love, then at least love what you do. So tell me what that means.
Yeah, so that's actually a bit personal to me in that I have always envied, those people who at a very young age, recognized their talent and they were like, yeah, I'm really passionate about this. I'm a great singer, or, I'm a musician, or I can paint, or like whatever, I can make ducks fly. Okay, that's not a talent, but people who very early on had a talent were able to recognize it and dive into that wholeheartedly and capitalize on that. That was never me, right? Like I have no pay the bills type of talents to speak of. So if you don't have that, does that then mean that I can't be successful? And that's where this sort of comes in. And that success to me is all about the mindset. And I really believe that if we can find joy and take pride in the jobs that we do and the things that we do, success will come on its own. So that's really what I mean by, if you don't really have the luxury to do what you love, that passion, at least love what it is that you do, nurture it, celebrate it. And to me, essentially, that just is the recipe for success.
I love that. And, I have to be really transparent. Like as we concluded our Spring World Tour, we had over 2,000 people register for events. We had 800 people show up on this world tour. We were talking internally and saying like, we are creating a real affinity to a job and to a career. And there are so many people that sometimes just kind of punch in and punch out. I don't always feel that with pre-sales professionals. And a lot of people do look at a job as a job and not necessarily a career or something that they're really taking pride and value in. And I think that that's what I love personally about this role so much, is that I take so much pride in what I do on a day-to-day basis. Do you have any perspectives there?
I think you're absolutely right. And I've been thinking about this question a little bit as well, because I would hate to be almost like judgmental and say there's only one right way. I think for many people, a job just is a job, and that could be fine for them too. I wouldn't know. I think it really depends. But what I will say though is I believe we as human beings all need that one thing. At least that one thing that keeps us going, that gets us up in the morning and gets us excited. And for the most of us, that sort of has to be our jobs, because that's where we spend the most time. Like, honestly, I spend more time with my colleagues than I do with my husband, right? So like, I better love what gets me up in the morning. So I think that whole thing about, oh, a job is just a job has almost been used as an excuse not to apply ourselves. And I just wanted to share, and I'm sure everyone knows this quote, right, by Dr. Martin Luther King. Do you know that one with the street sweeper?
I don't know if I know this one.
So Dr. Martin Luther King, he said a lot of smart stuff, right? But in particular, he said, if a man is called a street sweeper, he should sweep streets even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. Isn't that beautiful?
That's amazing.
I mean, Martin, come on. So I think that's really what this is all about, right? It doesn't matter what you do, but at least take pride and find joy and celebrate what you do, because I think that's really what life is all about. You need that thing to keep you going.
That's a great quote by Dr. King. And Dola, I really like what you're saying there, right? And I'm reflecting on my own experience. And I think for me, where I started to feel like I was taking and finding value in my job is when I was feeling like I was making an impact. And I started to take my reputation seriously. I have this mentality that people don't go to work to be C players, right? They don't go to work to underperform. They always want to do their best. Not everyone's trying to overexceed or go above and beyond every single day, but people want to do a good job. And I think I started to approach my solutions consulting role as a professional. I was a professional pre-sales person, and I took my reputation seriously and really felt like every time I was doing something, I wanted to do my best, not just for my teammates, but for our customers and prospects. And I was always looking at ways to better myself. And so what are some ways that you go about continuously improving on your craft?
That's a really good one, because I think the popular answer here would be, read books, listen to podcasts, listen to James' podcast, okay? Listen to the PNC podcast. I think that's the popular answer, and that's true. But personally, I think there's a lot to be said, and a big part of professional development is building a network, learning from people. So while there's a lot that you can find in books, there's a lot of learning and growth to be found in books, documentaries, news, articles, all of that. I have found that the most profound and impactful education that I have had came from connecting with people, and came from connecting with people who were outside of my immediate network. So speaking with people who are completely different from myself, learning about topics that I thought I knew all about, but speaking to people with a different perspective and relearning about those topics through their eyes, I think has been one of the most impactful sources of growth to me. Also, I think, just to go back on the reading and learning bit, I think where reading and learning becomes really interesting and really helpful is, so I'm an introvert. And that means that, going into large groups or networking and all of that can be a little bit intimidating, and it can certainly be energy draining. And one trick that I learned early on is learn about something, read the news, pick up on a popular topic that you have an opinion on, because then you can always default to that. You can talk about it without putting in too much effort into that. And that obviously puts you at ease, and so on and so forth. So I think that really helps you get above and beyond your own sphere of control, almost allows you to step outside of your comfort zone a little bit and explore. And that's how you can use reading as a tool as well.
I really like that perspective, Dola. And your response there made me really happy, because I have this fundamental belief that when you have something that you're trying to face at work, when you get an outside perspective, that's when innovation happens. That is like my fundamental math equation for PreSales Collective and PreSales Leadership Collective. And it is why we get people together in small roundtables and say, hey, here's a topic, talk about it for 15 minutes, and then go into breakout rooms. Because you're right, talking to someone else to understand how they're doing things, how they're approaching a certain situation is when sometimes the light bulb moment goes off internally. And I fundamentally believe that companies who have success, that's wonderful, but you have to adapt. You have to change because what got you here might not always get you there. And just understanding and learning from other people does allow us to really be the best version of ourselves. Stephanie Daniel, very early on this podcast, said that folks need to go out and talk to someone who doesn't look like them, getting out of our comfort zone. It is really important. And this has me thinking, right, about this concept of change. We talked about how sales has been different from years ago. And you've talked about really learning and then applying those learnings. And as I mentioned, like the world is fundamentally moving around us. And so we always have to adapt and change. And what sales looks like 10 years ago is much different than it looks today. And so how should pre-sales professionals approach the concept of change?
Always be learning. And that's the title of this podcast as well, right? So we are all work in progress. And I think the first step is actually acknowledging that, realizing that, and knowing that to be true. There's also a brilliant quote which says, change is the only constant in life. So that's back to what you were saying, right? Like the world is constantly moving, whether you like it or not, things are changing around you. So the best thing that you can do, and I tell this to my team as well, is if you get really good at anticipating change, and getting comfortable with change, that's where you have really cracked the code, I think. So being able to really anticipate not just what you need to know now, but what do you need to know in order to be relevant tomorrow? Where is this change taking us? And then starting to apply yourself and build skills and target your growth in those directions, I think is what's going to make you a better pre-sales professional.
I think that's a great answer. And I like that you immediately responded with readily. As a manager, how do you ensure your team is approaching their role with this ABL mentality?
First of all, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I don't believe it is my role as a manager to ensure that my team has that ABL mentality. I think that does and that should come from the individuals themselves. What I can do as a manager is to coach towards that and help them apply themselves and apply that mentality to help them achieve their goals. But everyone needs to be, I think, the gatekeepers of their own growth and their own ABL mentality. That being said, some of the things that we do and which I do together with my team in order to support that is everyone has a development plan. So we work together to set SMART goals and we really look at growth from a short-term perspective. So where do you want to be in 1 month, in 6 months, in a year from now? But we also look at it in terms of on a longer-term perspective. So where do you want to be in 3 years from now? Where do you want to be in 5 years from now? We are almost by doing that, instilling this practice of growth being a constant and continuously shaping that and evolving that. And that's really, really important because the organization that we're in any organization, is constantly changing. So it makes no sense to set goals today and expect to execute on those in 3 years from now, because in 3 years from now, the world can look completely different.
I appreciate you sharing that, Dola. I want to maybe dive into that a little bit more because you mentioned that it's not necessarily the manager's role to make sure that those folks have that mentality. But have you ever been in a situation where you feel like someone might just be in a rut? They might be in a situation where they're just not feeling challenged or they're not feeling like they're being the best version of themselves. And so they maybe had that ABL mentality previously, but they're somewhat stuck. Have you been in that situation before and how have you approached it?
Absolutely. I've been in that situation personally. I've had colleagues who've been in that situation. We've all been in that situation. If we're going to be fully honest, like we've all been in that situation. Let's not come on here on this podcast and start lying now. Let's be honest, people. So obviously, yes, we've all been in that situation. And I think the biggest source of empowerment for me in that is just the realization that I control what happens next. So really taking responsibility for that yourself, first and foremost. There are a bunch of tools and resources available to me that can help me and guide me and be a source of inspiration. But all of that is useless unless I am willing to take that step myself. So I control what happens next.
I want to ask you a very specific question. I'm not sure how you're going to respond to this one, but do you feel like we ever reach mastery?
That's a loaded question, isn't it?
It is.
I think we don't reach mastery, but we can reach very, very goodery. And what I mean by that is I am a firm believer that mastery is not a destination. It's a journey. There's always going to be something that you can learn. And that's back to change is the only constant. And what you said, the world keeps evolving and changing. So how are you going to achieve mastery if things are not constant?
I really appreciate that perspective, Dola, because almost where this question comes from is I think about a carpenter or something that actually gets called a master. This person has put in so many hours of work. They've done so many different jobs and projects over a long period of time that they get classified with this distinction. But are things changing around them? And it gets me thinking of tools change, the way maybe your building changes, what you're actually doing, and trends change. And I think that as that applies to the pre-sales role, can we really be masters? And I really like the quote of mastery is not a destination, but a journey. That is a very, very well said quote. As we talk about always be learning, with PreSales and PreSales Podcast, we talk a lot about brands and personal brands and really professional brand of pre-sales, like you've kind of alluded to previously. And Jeff Margulies, who is the head of pre-sales at ServiceNow, he's a PSC advisor and someone who's been very influential in my growth and learning, wrote an article titled Be Known for Something. And that has always resonated with me. And I continue to reflect on that. And, as it relates to this ABL concept, how should pre-sales professionals go about building their personal brand and being known for something?
First of all, figure out what your strengths are and focus on them. I think all too often we focus on our weaknesses and trying to bridge that gap. But there is a quote, and I don't know the quote word for word, but basically the point of it is it takes a whole lot more energy trying to fix what's wrong with you and become okay at that than it does to actually figure out what you're really good at and take that to the next level and become brilliant at it. So my first thing is, if you're starting to try and figure out what can be my personal brand, focus on your strengths. And there are a bunch of things you can do to get feedback about your strengths. You can do strengths finders. You can ask for feedback, do a 360 feedback review, talk to people who know you and get some feedback and understand where do your strengths really lie, and then focus on those and then figure out how can you make the most out of them. And I feel like when you have done that, most likely you will start to see potential and you will start to see opportunities in what your personal brand could be. And that, for me, is a much more rewarding journey than fighting to improve your weaknesses. And I really love what you said there that Jeff had written about being known for something, because that's really, really important. Know something. In pre-sales in particular, we can quite easily become generalists because we are the know-it-alls. We do it all, we know it all. That then makes it very difficult to say, how do we pick one apart from the other? So what I actually very early on told my team was, it's very important to identify what makes you unique. So you can be all of these things, you can be great at all of these things, but what makes you unique? What will have your name brought up in conversation? What sets you apart from the others? And even to the next level, and this can be a little bit controversial because we want people to tell us that they're going to stay with us forever. That's never going to happen, right? So you're building your portfolio, especially for the younger pre-sales generation, right? So you're building your portfolio, you're building your brand. What is it that you're going to bring with you to the next job and the next company? How are you going to sell yourself? What is going to sell it for you? Like, what's your product? So I think that's something that's really, really important. So I love that quote from Jeff.
I love the idea of continuing to double down on strengths. I have not been quiet about this, but the PreSales Collective, we do a lot of strengths training. We've been doing Gallup strengths. We work with Ross Rotherham, who was a former pre-sales leader at Akamai, is now doing his own coaching business. And we really believe in finding those things that you mentioned that we're good at. And what are we great at? And doubling down on those. I'm very self-aware, or I try to be self-aware, right? To understand like where are some of my weaknesses and try to slowly and incrementally build those up. But if I was spending, like you said, all my time trying to raise the floor, right, I wouldn't be getting closer to the ceiling and expanding that ceiling. And so I really like that perspective. And I think you nailed it when you talk about the generalist comment, because sometimes, oh, well, they're the smart people. They know everything. They're super expansive, but not necessarily being known for something that allows you to stand out. That's always really important. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like there's so many tidbits and quotes that I'm sitting here thinking about, like, what am I going to bring up in the post recap about today's episode? Because this has been really, really informative. We talked about people that were maybe feeling stuck previously and, want to close with the advice question, right? Like as it relates to learning and growth, what advice do you have for people who are feeling stuck in their pre-sales role?
That's the really important one, because as we've already said before, a lot of people will be feeling like this. Everyone will feel like this at some point in their careers or in their lives. I'm just going to share what I have done previously, what has worked for me. First thing is to really think about where you are in life. And I say that very deliberately, life, not just professionally, but also personally, because as much as we would like to keep those two separate, they're very much intertwined. So figure out where you are in life and map out where do you want to go. And a simple exercise that you can do is just map out what is your energy drain and what is your energy gain and separate those two. So what you want is you're going to want to have more things in your life that give you energy. And then what you can do is look at where you are and the surroundings in which you're operating and then evaluate, am I actually really in the right place? So now I know what's draining my energy. I know what's giving me energy. Am I really in the right place to achieve my goals? And most importantly, let's all remember, you are not a tree. You can move, right? You can move. That's super important. We have the power to move. So if you figure out that you're in a situation or you're in an environment which does not cater to those goals that you now have readily mapped out, then start thinking about what's then going to get you there. And you don't have to do it alone. And that's another thing. I think one of the mistakes that I made very early on is thinking that I have to figure it out and I have to do it alone. You don't have to do it alone. Find a mentor. It could be someone who is actually doing a job that excites you. Speak to them, try and figure out what's their journey, get some advice, work together with a coach. I've worked together with a couple of coaches and they are fantastic, absolute wizards. And they can really help you uncover your obstacles. And they can also help you uncover your potential and your opportunities. And I think all of that together is really, really powerful. And I really hope that it's helpful.
Dola, talk about helpful. This has been a fantastic podcast and very helpful for anyone who's in pre-sales, whether you're aspiring to be in pre-sales, you've been in the profession for a long time, or you're a leader. So I really appreciate the conversation. Thanks for all the advice and all the insight. And I hope to see you around the community.
Thanks, James. And I hope that you'll invite me over next time as well. And I promise to have listened to at least one of your podcasts.
Perfect. I appreciate it, Dola. Thanks for the time today. See you next time.
Thank you.
All right, PreSales Collective. I hope you had as much fun as I did today listening to Dola and hearing her perspective. I mean, she really brought the energy and a lot of impact on today's podcast. One of the things that she started off with that really resonated with me was this idea that success is all about the mindset. She joked that she didn't have any talent that paid the bills, so she had to learn and figure out what she was good at and nurture those strengths and celebrate them and become the best version of herself. And as we talked about looking at the role as a job, she brought up the very impactful Dr. King quote around the street sweeper. And that quote to me just says that we should always be doing the best that we can do and being the best version of ourselves and giving our all to what we're doing in that given time. And how we become the best version of ourselves is relying on our network. You hear me say this all the time with PreSales Collective about the network effect and learning from other people and getting different perspectives and how that allows us to think differently and shape the way we want to approach problem solving or approach our job. Talking to other people should either validate what we're doing or make us reconsider and challenge the status quo. The reality is that change is constant. You can disagree with this perspective that maybe the role is much different than it was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, but things are changing around us. Buying and selling are changing. And so we as pre-sales professionals need to be always elevating ourselves and at least staying aware of what's happening around us so that we can be learning. We can always be learning and having that mentality that mastery is not a destination, but really a journey. In pre-sales, we want to be known for something. A lot of times in our role, we're the smart people or the generalists or, the people that do so much. But how do we stand out in a crowd? How do we say, hey, Dola is known for this. James is known for this. How do we make sure that we are bringing that to our organizations, building our personal brand? And I love what Dola said about building development plans and being ready for the next job. It's just the reality is that people are going to move on in their careers. And I thought she gave a lot of great advice to recap us if we're feeling stuck in our role or not challenged, that we are not a tree. We can move around and finding things that give us energy gain versus energy drain and really understanding where we are in life. Because in our life, as Shelley Archibald told us on the WISE webinar back in 2021, is that it's work-life integration. It's just here. So understanding where we are both personally and professionally in our lives, where we can make that change. I hope you really enjoyed today's episode. I hope that you have this always be learning mentality, no matter how long you've been in the profession, no matter what you've been doing and how long you've been doing it. And I am curious if you have perspectives or thought from today's episode or things that resonate with you, message me on Slack or post on LinkedIn. Share those learnings. I say this all the time, but I really mean it. I want to see the learnings come to life in our profession, in our ecosystem, and be able to make an impact on other people who might be feeling or thinking the same thing, but not necessarily saying it. So let's put our always be learning hat on. Let's approach our job with the idea that we're going to be the best version of ourselves and that mastery is a journey. All right, PreSales Collective, I will see you next week.